This episode is going to be a hodgepodge of different verses in the New Testament that are related to the discussion over polygamy. But before doing that, I think it's important to briefly talk about the cultural context of the time. The Jewish population at the time of the New Testament was not the opulent kingdom of Israel that the Old Testament talks of under the rule of King David or King Solomon. Rather, it was a nation that had fallen under rule by the Roman Empire. The Romans had allowed the Israelites to maintain their traditions and practices to a certain extent, but it was always under the oversight of a Roman official. That's why Jesus goes before the court of the Jews before being given his final sentence by Pontius Pilate. The Jews made their case against Jesus, but didn't take any action of punishing Jesus before getting permission from the Roman Pontius Pilate. And we know that after the resurrection of Jesus and the explosion of the gospel message broke out all over the Mediterranean to the furthest reaches of the Roman Empire, the believers that came to Christ and made up the churches very soon were made up of majority Gentiles, non-Jews, Roman citizens throughout the known world. It was under this context that many of the epistles of the New Testament were addressed, especially those written by Paul, because Paul was commissioned to reach the Gentile nations with the news of Jesus. This is important to understand for this reason. The Romans did not practice polygamy like the nation of Israel did. In fact, it was against Roman law to practice polygamy. And the Romans only allowed Israel to maintain the practice to a degree because it was so inherent to their way of life and their own laws. The same laws I've been going over throughout this series. But the Jews definitely were practicing polygamists, even into the New Testament age. And that is simply a matter of historical record. Flavius Josephus in his Annals records enough evidence to prove that. And there are others. But even though Rome allowed it to a certain point, for example, Herod the Great, the same Herod who tried to kill Jesus as a baby, he was Rome appointed and was allowed by Rome to have multiple wives due to his jurisdiction. But all that didn't prevent the decline of polygamy as a practice amongst the Jews as time went on, in terms of popularity. And some biblical commentators seem to think that the Jews were growing in their wisdom in concluding that polygamy was wrong, while those same commentators ignore the fact that Roman law and culture was simply anti-polygamous as a way of life when they had controlled Israel. Still, the practice amongst the Jews was so strong that it had the momentum to still be a prevalent issue even under Roman rule. I'm bringing all of this up to say that all of this context is absent of the majority of epistles written in the New Testament because the target audience that Paul is addressing is outside of Jewish backgrounds. They are not natives to the lands or cultures of Israel. They are Gentile believers, people who are under the practice and culture of Roman norms and standards of living. So even though Paul is a trained theologian and Jewish Pharisee who knows the laws on polygamy, he also knows that isn't the goal of his commission as an apostle. The goal of his commission was to spread the gospel, and matters about what the law says on polygamy are secondary to that vocation. Paul isn't going to give a lecture about how to have two wives to an audience that isn't doing anything wrong when they simply just have one wife, as was normal in Roman cultures anyway. And it would make much more sense and beneficial to the growth of the church to teach the meaning of the resurrection, the gospel message, and to teach moral laws that did confront particular sins that Roman citizens were dealing with in their Roman context at the time. For example, going to pagan temples and consorting with temple prostitutes. It makes no sense to spend time teaching Roman husbands how to not show favoritism to one wife over the other wife when it wasn't even part of Roman culture to have two wives in the first place. Nevertheless, Paul is careful to never teach against polygamy or say anything that would contradict the laws of polygamy when he is appealing to the Old Testament laws as he taught and edified the churches, as he visited and wrote when he was bringing to their doorsteps the culture and laws of Judaism. Now, having introduced all that, let's consider one of the objections given against polygamy that is by way of analogy. You'll hear critics constantly say that Christ has only one bride, the church, or that there is only one church that is married to Christ, and that this somehow means that every man should therefore also only have one wife and is forbidden from taking any more wives. This particular critique is an appeal not to any statute, law, or commandment, but rather to a metaphorical picture used by the Bible to communicate the covenant the church has with Christ. Yes, the word is in the singular form, but it is a word that denotes a collection of people. It means the ones called out, a plurality of people. Arguing against polygamy based on this, when the word literally means a multitude of people, is like someone who says they believe in only one marriage because they have only one harem. But let's not forget that Paul uses different pictures to communicate the same relationship the church has to Jesus, such as slaves to a master, stones to a cornerstone, body parts to a head, and also individuals engaged for marriage to the same husband. Paul says in 2 Corinthians 11, verse 2 that, quote, I betrothed you to one husband, to Christ. The word you in that verse is in the plural form of Greek. So Paul is saying, I betrothed all of you to one husband, to Christ. Here, Paul is recognizing the betrothal of many to one, many to a singular husband as an image of the church. And he develops this into the image of the bride of Christ when he says later in that verse, so that I might present you as a pure virgin to him. That is, present you all as a pure virgin. And this is where the critics' feet should be held to the fire. Because for them to reference the image of the one church as Christ's one bride, as if it is proof somehow that having two brides would be wrong, I would press the critic to stop skipping over the rest of the parts of that image. Because it's not just one bride, but one pure virgin bride. To condemn a man for having two brides simply because of the image of Christ having one bride would also necessarily mean that that same image, according to the critic, would also be prohibiting a woman from ever entering into a marriage if she is not a pure virgin, since such a thing would be outside the nature of the relationship being communicated by that same image. Would there be a critic that could consistently hold that no non-virgin woman should ever be allowed to enter into a marriage? I think not. And that's to their credit, because such a position is pretty obviously contrary to what the scripture allows for marriage. But this is all to communicate that the nature of this image is truly a beautiful thing, but it is not the law, nor is it trying to pretend to be the law. And it is the law and commandments from God that should be used to hold men accountable, as opposed to standards used in the form of parables or figurative imagery to communicate points, which was never meant to substitute or go against the law and the commandments. Arguing that the image of one church as one bride means that all of the polygamy laws are now therefore unlawful is as illogical as saying that being completely unmarried is also unlawful based on this image. And although I'm sure someone would be quick to point out that that comparison is unfair because Paul teaches that Christians are allowed to remain unmarried given their particular situation in 1 Corinthians 7, I would respond that Paul also allows for polygamy given their particular situation based on the laws in that same chapter. Let's look at two laws Paul gives in that chapter. A couple of laws, actually. 1 Corinthians 7, verses 10 and 11. The wife should not separate from her husband, but if she does, she should remain unmarried, or else be reconciled to her husband. Verse 12. If any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever, and she consents to live with him, he should not divorce her. Verse 15. But if the unbelieving partner separates, let it be so. In such cases, the brother or sister is not enslaved. And verse 27 and 28. Are you free from a wife? Do not seek a wife. But if you do marry, you have not sinned. Now let's apply these laws to a hypothetical scenario. And though it be hypothetical, it is not unrealistic in the least. Let's say that a husband hears a street preacher, and becomes converted to Christ. This new life of his is hard on his wife, but she still is fine with continuing on with the marriage. Should the husband divorce his unbelieving wife? Verse 12 teaches no. Now let's say that he grows in his faith so much that it is now bothering the wife to the degree that she decides to leave him. So she is no longer willing to live with him, and she divorces him. Despite his best efforts, she moves out and divorces her husband. The husband is reminded of verse 15 during this whole ordeal. But in his loneliness, he meets another woman at church who fancies him, and he desires to marry her. Should he? Or rather, can he? Verse 27 and 28 teach yes. So then, let's say that the man does. He marries her. Now let's say the separated wife, while she was away living on her own, hears the same street preacher and becomes convicted in her heart and also becomes converted to Christ. In her Bible studies, she finds verse 10 and 11, and she clings to these verses, feeling guilty and having hope now because she has desires of amending and fixing her marriage to her husband. For while she was separated from her husband, she never touched another man. So she goes back to her husband and seeks reconciliation because of verse 11. When the husband meets her, he is joyous at her conversion and is still attracted to her, as he was when they first got married. And when he hears her plea and her desire to be reconciled in their marriage and her consent to live with him again, is the husband allowed to take her back? What does verse 10, 11, and 12 say? It says that she is to be reconciled to her husband if she was previously separated. So in this scenario, the commands allow for the man to take her back, to let her be reconciled. And following these commands in this scenario would lead to a biblical polygamous situation. Now, the only way to avoid this conclusion is for critics to make up laws that aren't there or to take exception with Paul and his commands. I had one critic comment that this very scenario would not allow for polygamy because the woman in this scenario would not be held accountable to the life she led before she became a Christian, which is actually a very anti-Christian thing to say. If a man steals a watch from a store, hears the gospel the next day, and becomes converted to Christ, does he conclude that he can still keep the watch just because he happened to steal it before he became a Christian? No, of course not. On the contrary, he's even more obligated now to return the watch. Just because you become a Christian does not release you from the obligations you've made to others, especially when those obligations are commanded and regulated by the very God you've committed your life to following now. But you see, these are the corners that critics dig themselves into when they stubbornly kick against the goads. And concerning the pastoral epistles that are often quoted about elders and deacons being the husband of one wife as proof texts against polygamy, I would like to let one John Piper speak on that. Here is John Piper, in an effort to teach against polygamy, actually show how these verses in particular are not talking about polygamy at all, because the wording employed is actually speaking about being faithful not to one wife, but to your first wife, according to the Greek. That is, you are not to be divorced from a first wife. Here's John Piper.
It is required of elders that they be the husband of one wife. 1 Timothy 3:2. Now, probably that doesn't refer to polygamy, because in 1 Timothy 5:9, the same phrase is used to describe the widows who need to qualify for the care of the church, and they are supposed to be wives of one husband, and there's no evidence that polyandry, multiple husbands, was a problem, and therefore wife of one husband, husband of one wife is probably not directly addressed to the issue of polygamy, but rather probably was addressed to be faithful to your spouse and don't be divorced from your spouse. But here's the point. Regarding polygamy, Paul never would have used those words without qualification if polygamy were being permitted in the church and among the leaders of the church. He just never would have been able to use that language without some qualification.
So Piper, in his admission that polygamy is not taught against in that verse, appeals to the idea that these verses would have needed more clarification if polygamy was being practiced by the churches in the first century, and that the absence of this practice is somehow proof that it was outlawed. But as I pointed out from the very beginning of this video, polygamy was outlawed. Outlawed by Rome, not the Bible. Polygamy was unpracticed, not only in the churches, but in the Roman Empire in general. The Roman Gentile culture that Paul was evangelizing to was anti-polygamy to begin with. So the lack of polygamy is an argument from silence, which is a weak argument. And if you're going to draw any conclusion at all from a weak argument like that, it isn't the conclusion that anti-polygamy sentiments were a staple of the Bible, but rather a staple of Roman culture. The last thing I want to touch on is the issue of concubinage in the New Testament. Because though Paul does not go into detail concerning this topic, he does address it in passing in Galatians chapter 4, when teaching on Abraham and his concubine Hagar. Paul teaches that Abraham's concubinal relationship with Hagar is allegorically representative of being, quote, under the law, while teaching against the Judaizer heresy. Because in that passage, Paul shows that Abraham's pursuit to attain an inheritance through the instrument of the concubine was similar to the Judaizer pursuit of justification through the instrument of the law. That's why he calls Hagar representative of the old covenant. Now keep in mind, Abraham had slept with Hagar prior to God giving Abraham the promise. So Abraham wasn't guilty of the sin of the Judaizers. Abraham wasn't guilty of turning down God's promise in pursuit of attaining an inheritance on his own terms. No, Abraham had just been striving for an inheritance by any means he could. But once God promised it would happen with Sarah, Abraham had an unwavering faith. But Paul uses these two images to contrast the means of being under the law with being under grace or under faith of the promise. Paul condemning the practice of being under the law is all the more striking considering that the Judaizers have a promise that Abraham didn't get until later, and yet the Judaizers are still deciding to use the means of the law to attain that promise instead of the instrument of faith. And Paul's condemnation is not a condemnation of the law in and of itself. The law itself is not being condemned by Paul. It's only being under the law that Paul is condemning. It's a condemnation of an improper use of the law. Paul didn't want people to attain acceptance into heaven or justification by means of the law. He wanted people to accept Christ by faith as their instrument into heaven for their justification. That's the gospel. And once this justification takes place, Paul then turns around and defends and upholds the law as a good practice because it can then be used for what it was meant for in the Christian life. We know this because Paul says in Romans chapter 3, verse 31, "Do we then overthrow the law by this faith? By no means. On the contrary, we uphold the law." So the fact that Paul refers to Abraham's use of Hagar for a concubine as an example of being, quote, under the law is proof to me that concubinage is part of the law. It is lawful per Paul's teaching here. It's how you use the law that determines if your actions are right or wrong. It's how you use concubinage that determines if you're right or wrong. The Judaizers' use of the law is wrong because it's being under the law. But that means the law is good if used properly. If Abraham would have used Hagar as a way to attain the promise of God for an inheritance after God already promised Abraham that inheritance through Sarah, then Abraham would have been wrong because it would have been in such a way that he was choosing to be under the law. But we know Abraham didn't do that. No, he believed God's promise. But it is the Judaizers who who are rejecting that promise of God for justification and instead going with the law. A law that is good in and of itself, but is just being used wrongly by the Judaizers. And that also means that concubinage is good in and of itself if used properly. Which reminds me of how Paul puts it in 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 8, when he says, "We know that the law is good if one uses it properly."